to illustrate that. But then how do we make sure we can prove that it stays down there securely? We do have regulations in place. That's the role of the regulations. So no operator is allowed to start a project without a permit, and he has to prove that the site's going to be safe before he even gets that permit. And then in operation, it has to be monitored to prove. We have international regulations in place under the UNFCCC, under the Clean Development Mechanism. We have them for storage in geological formations offshore under the London Protocol. We have the International Standards Organization has a suite of standards on CCS, and individual countries and regions such as the EU have CCS-specific regulations. And they're all based around the IPCC's Greenhouse Gas Inventory Guidelines methodology from 2006. So why are we looking at CCS? Well, if you can remember the 1.5 report from the IPCC in 2018, 3 of the 4 scenario pathways relied heavily upon CCS. And the one that didn't relied more heavily upon behaviour change, and it was also a more expensive pathway. My colleagues in the International Energy Agency in Paris, they do their analysis for the role of all the low carbon technologies in the energy sector. And to get the energy sector to net zero by 2050, we need to do all of the things, all of the solar, wind, energy efficiency, electric vehicles, but CCS has a role of about 25% of that mitigation effort. And that's a big role. And they went into more detail last year in their special report on CCUS and highlighted, I think very clearly, the main unique applications of CCS, the unique attributes of this suite of technologies. And the first one is its retrofitability. It can be fitted to existing energy assets, so you don't have to dismantle your energy system in your country. It's also a solution for these hard-to-abate sectors. I mentioned cement already, iron and steel and others, and potentially aviation as well, through synthetic aviation fuels. And it's also a route to getting low-cost, low-carbon hydrogen produced from natural gas, and the direct air capture, removing carbon from the atmosphere as well. And this year, my colleagues produced this net zero roadmap to 2050, and it produced some headline items in there about no new coal plants, no new oil and gas developments. But within this, they quantify the role of carbon capture and storage, that we need to be storing 4 gigatons of carbon dioxide by 2035, 4 gigatons per year, and 7.6 gigatons per year by 2050. So 4 gigatons a year in 14 years' time, that's 100 times more than we're doing at the moment. But do we have some projects? Yes, we do. We've got decades of experience now with large-scale million tons a year projects. Just to show you what they look like, the Leipner project in the North Sea there on the left has been operating since 1996. The one in the middle is on a coal power station in Canada, operating since 2014. And the one on the right is at a Shell refinery in Canada, operating since 2015, all at about 1 million tons a year. Do we have enough projects? No, we don't. And thanks to my colleagues in the Global CCS Institute, they produce every year a global status report that updates us on the progress with CCS, including on the large-scale projects. And I borrow their map from last year. There was a map recently out for this year. And this shows you the distribution of projects around the world. But what that map says to me is there's far more countries on that map that haven't yet started CCS projects. And that's of particular interest because countries have to reduce their emissions under the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement works with the nationally determined contributions, and we've seen a flood of those in the last 2 weeks before COP26. We have 123 now submitted, and they're all looking to 2030, but there's only 14 of those include CCS. So I've listed them in the slide there, and these slides will be available afterwards. So that's not so many. And that's especially important for developing countries who may want to access multilateral climate finance, because having it in their NDCs or their technology needs assessments is important for them to get this climate finance. So as well as not many having CCS in, we know from the UNFCCC's own analysis, the NDCs promised, and these are the ones measured up to the end of July, they're not enough. They're not enough to get us to 2 degrees, let alone getting us to 1.5 degrees warming. And this was the analysis from their report in September, showing that we're still on the path to 2.7. And I know that with the flood of new NDCs just before COP, we're now a bit better than that. We're on the path from the NDCs towards 2.4 degrees of warming by the end of the century, but that's still not enough. The Paris Agreement also requires countries to submit these long-term strategies looking to the mid-century. And here it's more promising. So only 43 countries of the 195 have submitted them, but most of these have CCS in them. And this is good because it's making countries think beyond their immediate political horizons, beyond their NDCs, where they put the easier to do mitigation in. They've got to mitigate all of their emissions. And these are the countries that have CCS in their NDCs. Within this environment at COP26, UNFCCC, CCS was really accepted in 2011 when it was adopted into the Clean Development Mechanism with its own rules to allow carbon credits from CCS to be equal to other carbon credits, and that applies specifically to developing countries then. And since then we've been active here in sharing information to countries coming along to learn about CCS. And here I must point out as well, the hosts of COP26, the presidency of COP26 is the UK government. And the UK government has been playing a very important role in assisting countries to get on the curve on CCS. And that's through its funding to the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank to their CCS trust funds. So through the Asian Development Bank, which also had money from the Australian government, they funded studies in China, Indonesia and Pakistan. And they've supported they are supporting a centre of excellence in Indonesia and in China. The World Bank funds that also have Norwegian government contributions have funded studies in South Africa, Mexico, Egypt and Botswana, and are supporting the current Centre of Excellence in South Africa. And just to draw attention to one of those centres of excellence, they're really important in those countries. They help to inform the governments on whether they can do CCS or not, how they can do it, where the right geology is, where the sources are, and joining it all up to inform the government policy. And the Indonesian Centre of Excellence is an excellent model from there. And this is just one slide. I know it's very busy from my colleague, Dr. Mohammed Rahmat Sula from the Institute Technology Bandung. But this just shows all the different things that they, as a Centre of Excellence, are able to do, including developing and operating the first injection pilot project in Indonesia, and lots of other informing government policy as well. So today we've got some interesting and new developments to share from some very special countries, from some very special speakers. So I'll just run through these first. We have Dr. Jennifer Wilcox, Acting Assistant Secretary from the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management in the US Department of Energy. We have Ruth Herbert, who's the CEO of the Carbon Capture and Storage Association, talking about what's happening in the UK, and there's a lot happening very recently here. Dr. Katherine Romanak from the University of Texas will be talking about demonstrating storage and assistance for developing countries, and there's a lot of CCS going on in the United States as well. Dr. Victor Richard Osu from the Nigerian Office of the Vice President will be talking about the latest new developments in Nigeria with their strategy on CCUS. And on my slide, you see Jonas Helseth. Unfortunately, he's been called away, but we're very lucky to have Eivind Børstad in his place. Thank you, Eivind, for coming at short notice from Bellona to talk about CCS infrastructure. And our last speaker is Beth Valiaho from the International CCS Knowledge Centre. Now, she's not able to be here in person because she's just given birth. So welcome to John Edward Valiaho, born on the 5th of November. She has presented via video, and we have Professor Niall McDowell here, who's from Imperial College, but also working with the International CCS Knowledge Centre as well, to take questions relating to their work. So that's the end of what I wanted to say introducing, and what I'd like to do now is introduce or bring up Jennifer Wilcox, who has a video to present to you. Now, Jennifer was here in the COP26 but unfortunately she booked her travel before we got the date for this side event, so she had to go back on Tuesday, but she's left this video presentation for you.
Good morning. My name is Jennifer Wilcox, Acting Assistant Secretary for the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management at the U.S. Department of Energy. And I want to thank the IEA Greenhouse Gas R&D program and our colleagues from the UK, Canada, and Indonesia for leading this discussion and advancing the development of CCS Centers of Excellence. I also want to thank my fellow speakers for their contributions and thank all of you for joining us today. As we meet today, we're facing an urgent but shrinking window of opportunity to limit the harm from the climate crisis, with special urgency for the most vulnerable populations. And as we look at technology approaches to address the climate crisis and achieve deep decarbonization, carbon capture and dedicated storage remains a proven approach to reducing point source emissions from power plants and some industrial facilities. In the United States, we're committed to advancing CCS. And in the past 5 years, the Department of Energy has invested $1.2 billion to develop CCS technologies. As most of you are probably aware, for the last 20 years or so, we've been focused on carbon capture approaches in the power sector, specifically associated with coal-fired power plants. But as we're moving forward, we also want to expand our efforts to capturing CO2 emissions from committed infrastructure expected to last beyond mid-century, including natural gas-fired power plants and industrial sectors like hydrogen, cement, and steel production. Once CO2 is captured, the question is, what do we do with all of the CO2? It's on the order of gigatons. Of course, we can advance approaches and increase dedicated and reliable storage deep underground in geologic formations. But CO2 can also be converted to high-value products like fuels and chemicals, or even longer-lived products like synthetic aggregate or concrete for building and construction. For CCS to achieve maximal impact, we need to take carbon capture out of its silo and leverage our efforts to achieve deep decarbonization toward the development of low-carbon supply chains where carbon can be stored in products like concrete, chemicals, and fuels, in addition to advancing low-carbon supply chains for products like cement and steel. And this has been an important focus of our RDD and D efforts at the Department of Energy. And ultimately, we want to build on those successes and develop more novel approaches to recycle carbon emissions as well. But it's not just our work that's making a difference. The work of countries represented by my colleagues here today, the UK, Canada, and Indonesia, also advancing CCS. And I want to specifically note that we're seeing exciting new movements in CCS in Asia with the launch of the Asia CCS network to develop and deploy these technologies in that region. And while the movement towards CCS deployment is encouraging, there's still challenges, both in terms of addressing the technical, financial, and policy challenges to the deployment, and in the sheer scope of the decarbonization that will be required to meet climate targets. I think it's also important to note that if we were a decade or so ago, we could have just simply focused on avoiding CO2 emissions in the first place and looking at just mitigating the CO2. But we're no longer in a position, we're running out of time. In their recent report, the IPCC noted, it's not enough to simply cut emissions. We have to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. Recent studies from the US National Academy of Sciences to the International Energy Agency reported that by 2050, we'll have to remove on the order of gigatons of CO2 from the atmosphere every year through carbon dioxide removal methods like direct air capture to achieve our net zero carbon emissions goals. Nearly all climate models that show paths to net zero indicate the need for a near-term focus on the deployment of carbon dioxide removal from the accumulated pool of CO2 in the atmosphere, termed CDR, in addition to point source carbon capture coupled to dedicated storage. In fact, IPCC modeling shows that only emission scenarios, including CDR, achieve net zero by mid-century. Getting to gigatons of CO2 removal by mid-century will require us to advance the field at an unprecedented pace. And with the recently launched Orca project, we're removing on the order of thousands of tons of CO2 per year, Over the next decade, we'll have to increase this 1,000-fold, up to millions of tons of CO2 removal from the atmosphere to be on track. We should also not view CDR as a method for offsetting emissions that we can avoid with existing technologies, such as decarbonizing fossil fuels or point source capture on industrial facilities like cement and steel. Rather, CDR should be viewed as a tool that counterbalances only the truly hard to avoid emissions, such as those from the agriculture or aviation sectors. This is a challenge, but we have a unique opportunity and a compelling responsibility to advance carbon removal approaches to achieve decarbonization and help tackle the climate crisis. And that's why we're launching the new mission with a focus on CDR and advance these approaches along a path to achieve net reduction on the order of tens of millions of metric tons of CO2 per year globally by 2030, less than a decade away. So we have a unique opportunity, a compelling responsibility to advance these technology approaches to achieve decarbonization and help tackle the climate crisis. But getting there requires collaboration across government, industry, and academia, and across international borders, especially with developing countries and others who need our assistance to decarbonize their industries. Establishing CCS Centers of Excellence is an exciting approach to help achieving this goal. So my message to you today is that the United States and the Department of Energy welcome the opportunity to work with our partners around the world to develop and deploy technology solutions like CCS and CDR to meet that challenge. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Acting Assistant Secretary Wilcox, for your presentation. And while Dr. Wilcox was here, she actually launched 2 initiatives on CDR. One was the Earthshot for carbon negative, to get the costs of CDR, CO2 removal from the atmosphere, down to $100 a tonne by the end of this decade. And the other one was Mission Innovation's challenge on CDR, to collaborate around the world in the development of these technologies. So Dr. Wilcox was very busy while she was here. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce Ruth Herbert, the CEO, or the Chief Executive of the Carbon Capture and Storage Association. So Ruth, over to you.
Thank you, Tim. I'm delighted to be part of this event. The Carbon Capture and Storage Association plays a key role in promoting the commercial deployment of carbon capture, use and storage technologies. And we're here at COP talking about the potential for these technologies, the developments in the UK, but also the potential to use this technology globally. So a key driver really for the UK's recent announcements on CCUS, which I'll come to in a moment, has been the work of the Climate Change Committee in the UK. The Climate Change Committee in the UK were asked by the UK government to go and look at the feasibility of the UK reaching net zero by 2050, and also to look at the cost of that. I'm delighted to say that the Climate Change Committee, which is an independent body in the UK, came back and gave the government some really good advice. Not only could we reach net zero by 2050, but also it would cost only around 1% of GDP. And critically, as part of that, part of the actions that we would need to take to do that, we would they said that CCUS, carbon capture, use and storage, was no longer an option, but it was indeed essential to being able to meet that target. This is because carbon capture, use and storage reaches the harder to decarbonise sectors that other technologies can't reach. It's an essential enabler of clean hydrogen production, as we've heard Jennifer say, greenhouse gas removals, so the ability to go carbon negative with bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, BECCS, and direct air capture, DACs. It is the only way to achieve heavy industry decarbonisation on this timescale, and it can also be used for flexible zero carbon electricity, which is important in the UK context, and I'll come to that in a moment. They also, the Climate Change Committee, came back to the government in their 6th carbon budget and recommended that the UK should actually adopt a nearer term target to ensure that we get to net zero by 2050. And this was that we should adopt a 78% greenhouse gas emissions reduction by 2035, which has now been adopted by the UK government. The net zero pathway, which is one pathway of a number of pathways within the Climate Change Committee's advice, actually requires 104 million tonnes of CO2 to be permanently stored every year by 2050 in the UK. And a sort of interim target there of 53 million tonnes a year by 2035. And as you can see in the graph here, CCS has a range of applications and is very important for the industrial sector in the UK. Now, to talk a little bit about the industrial sector in the UK, it's actually the case that for several decades, really, some of our industrial heartlands, they are around the edges of the country, they are located in the ports of the UK, traditionally have been struggling for a number of reasons, trying to actually kind of have a competitive industry in a global or a sort of an international industry where there is often a race to bottom in terms of environmental and other standards has been really challenging. And what we've seen in the UK geology is that the actual ideal locations for carbon capture, use and storage are the offshore, subsea, storage sites offshore, and that actually these are really usefully situated next to our industrial heartlands where the majority of the UK's emissions are being emitted. So the CCSA did a study looking at the opportunity for CCUS in the UK, and we actually found that deploying CCUS at scale across our industrial heartlands in key clusters where they will use shared infrastructure, transport and storage infrastructure in the most efficient way would actually generate 10,000 new green jobs and retain 50,000 jobs in industries such as steel, cement production, refining, chemicals, ceramics and glass. It would actually help retain 50,000 jobs, which otherwise, if we are to meet our targets otherwise, those jobs would have moved offshore. They would have left the UK. Those industries would have shut down because it would have been impossible to do it without CCUS on those industries. And that would have resulted in carbon leakage, which would have been no good for our climate ambitions globally. So it's really, really important to us that we actually create low carbon clusters in the UK and we use also our sort of oil and gas skills and infrastructure to enable that carbon dioxide from those industries to be transported and stored under the sea. And there are also potential for additional jobs that would otherwise have not come to the UK as a result of inward investment that we expect to see on the back of this. So finally, the announcements really over the last few weeks from the UK in this area, there was an announcement that the UK government would, over a year ago, there was an announcement that the UK government would commit to 4 clusters being operational by 2030, with the first clusters being operational by the mid-2020s. That ambition was reaffirmed in the net zero strategy, and the same day, earlier that day, a couple of weeks ago, the government announced that it would be proceeding with the first 2 clusters, the East Coast cluster and the HyNet Northwest cluster, and they would be track 1 clusters, meaning they would progress immediately with the aim of being operational in the mid-2020s. And the Scottish cluster was announced as a reserve. At the same time, the government increased their ambition to 20 to 30 million tonnes in 2030, when a year ago they had a target of 10 million tonnes a year by 2030. So that is basically a tripling of the ambition of the amount to be stored per year in the UK. So we're really excited about that, and we know that we need at least 4 clusters to do that, and we're looking forward to hearing about the next cluster's timeline very soon. And crucially, there were targets right out to 2050 in this document for CCUS, with a crucial one of at least 50 million tonnes a year expected by the mid-2030s, which aligns with the projection of the Climate Change Committee. So really good news. We're pressing on with CCUS in the UK, and we see it as really crucial to the survival of our industrial heartlands as we seek to reach our net zero target. I have a final slide, which I was not going to spend much time on, but just to say there have been a number of targets across power, CCUS, industrial CCUS, hydrogen production, engineered greenhouse gas removals, which were within the net zero strategy. And there are different business models that are being looked at in terms of the operational long-term funding of these projects. A key one, I think, is the carbon-based CFD, which is being designed for industrial CCUS, and it's also being looked at for clean hydrogen production, and the transport and storage model, which the UK is going to fund under a regulated asset-based model, and there is some upfront capital committed to that already in the CCUS Infrastructure Fund, 1 billion to progress the clusters that have been announced. So happy to talk more about that under questions.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ruth. That was really, really interesting and exciting new developments happening in the UK. And I think it's good evidence-based, science-based policy making. Ruth, you referred to the Climate Change Committee's work saying the need for CCS in the UK. I think the CCSA deserves credit for showing how it can be done, how it can be delivered, and working with the government in the development of policies and the business models. So I think plaudits to CCSA absolutely for these developments in the UK. So now I'd very much like to introduce Dr. Katherine Romanak from the Gulf Coast Carbon Centre in the Bureau of Economic Geology at the University of Texas at Austin, who's going to share some wisdom on demonstrating storage and assistance for developing countries. Thank you, Katherine.
Thank you, Tim. Yes. So I'm with the Gulf Coast Carbon Center at the University of Texas at Austin, where we have over 20 years of experience in actually developing and implementing geologic CO2 storage and everything around CO2 storage. So we've been actually monitoring real projects storing millions of tons of CO2 in the ground. And we really got this opportunity because of the U.S. Department of Energy's commitment to developing CO2 storage in the U.S. over the past 20 years, where we started very small with small injections and characterizing our resources, and then going up eventually to 1.5 million ton injections per year. The program was so successful, and we have gained so much assurance in the technology that we are now developing 50 million ton sites to move forward towards our goals. So for those of you that just don't really know about CCS, just a quick thing about how it works. So CO2 is injected into the subsurface via wells, and it's injected into reservoirs with porosity that will accept the CO2, which are overlain by layers that have no porosity, which will work as sealing layers. And so the CO2 is injected very deep, 800 meters at least, beneath the surface, where there is salty, briny water that exists in these formations. The CO2 pushes the brine out of the way and is trapped in the small pore spaces within the rocks. As Tim had mentioned earlier, there are several mechanisms for trapping the CO2, and so we know that over time it becomes even more secure. So what I want to say is that we know now that geological CO2 storage is safe by design. We do extensive site characterization to ensure that we choose the right places to store the CO2. We have to get permits for these injections, which take a high level of assurance. Then we do risk assessments with modeling to identify any potential unwanted outcomes, and we further design the project to minimize any potential risks. And then we monitor the project, and we monitor it in the deep subsurface to verify that the CO2 plume is behaving as we expected, and then we monitor in the shallow subsurface to assure that there are no unwanted outcomes to the environment. So the first step in getting on the path to CCS for countries that want to perhaps do this is to do a carbon storage atlas. The first step is for any country that wants to start looking into doing CCS is to find out where are our emission sources and where are the sinks, and start getting an idea of the potential in your country. There are mechanisms within the United Nations that can help and fund developing countries. The CTCN is one that can respond to any developing country that requests if they would like to develop a storage atlas, as an example. And you can gain, any country that asks can gain up to a value of $250,000 from the CTCN. Once you progress your storage atlas and you progress towards a pilot project, it's possible then to go to the Green Climate Fund, which is a higher level of support for projects. So what I'd like to do today is just give an invitation to countries to get on the path to CCS. CCS technologies can take a while to develop, and yet we know that 75% of the emissions reductions that are needed to reach our climate goals must come from developing countries. So this is an invitation, and we would like to work with any country that would like to try to get on the path to help you explore the opportunities, the funding opportunities, the opportunities you have within your country, how to utilize funding mechanisms, and then plug you into an international support system that includes the CSLF, which is a ministerial level initiative, and as we heard Jennifer Wilcox talking about, centers of excellence, and just explore memberships and interactions with experienced organization. We know from experience that it takes only one champion in a country to take CCS forward, and a lot can be achieved. And so this is a heartfelt invitation. Just get on the path to CCS. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Katherine. And thanks also to the US DOE for funding all of that work, those demonstration projects that you've worked on. Katherine's actually monitored the CO2 for major projects in the US with her colleagues, and that learning from those experiences, the US is very good at making that public and sharing with the rest of the world, so they benefit. And we see that even the Quest project that Shell has in Canada learned from the US projects in developing their monitoring plans, for example. So now it gives me great pleasure. Katherine mentioned champions. And now I'd like to introduce a champion for CCUS in Nigeria, Dr. Victor Richard Osu, who's from the Office of the Vice President. And this is very new developments from Nigeria. And Victor, I'd like to hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you, everyone. So today, we're talking about Nigeria, the CCUS development in Nigeria. We recently came into the focus. We started this journey back then in July, and as at today, we have funding from the World Bank to support CCUS development in hard to abate area. But let's give a little bit of context how we arrived at CCUS development. First of all, we started looking at the energy transition and net zero target. Within the context of a net zero, we have three scenarios. One is the business as usual, then second is the core NDC guided, and third one is the deep decarbonization. Within the deep decarbonization, we have a target, a net zero target of actually achieving net zero by 2050, but now it's about 2060. But yet, carbon capture utilization became a very key priority to the government, which has been led by the Office of the Vice President on Energy Transition. And so areas and sectors that we looked at within that energy transition was the industry, power, oil and gas, building, and the transport sector. Coming into CCUS specifically, we looked at the drivers. Why should we go into CCS? That was a very key debate in Nigeria, because recently we had what we call the Petroleum Industrial Act that was just approved by the president, and that act demonstrates that Nigeria will be focusing on gas development. Also, the Nigeria Economic Sustainability Plan, which is being chaired by the Office of the Vice President, also indicated that gas is going to be very, very important for our development, especially clean cooking using LPG. And then it was mentioned in the National Determined Contribution that oil and gas and industries such as cement will be core sectors that we need to decarbonize, and the just transition also as part of the energy transition remit. We now move down to the sectors to now look at where exactly do we fit in CCUS. We know that the oil and gas have potential experience, but again, our main target now was focused on hard to decarbonize industries such as cement, iron and steel, including the energy sector, but this will be done phase by phase. And these are the potential emission sources. I think I won't go deep into this because already Tim and Katherine and Ruth have shared some of these potential sources. But you can see there that cement, chemical and iron and steel are very key for CCUS emission sources. So the proposed work program that is being looked at now is, first of all, to start with a technical assessment. This technical assessment should be able to identify the sources and the sink. We do have hubs that we've, I think that was done within 2-3 years ago, where we have Kaduna, Lokoja, Lagos, and Port Harcourt as a potential hub, but that has to be verified. And through that means we'll be doing a pilot pilot or a commercial on commercial basis. Also, we'll be looking at the legal and regulatory framework that needs to be in place to support CCUS development. Also, stakeholders engagement. This is really very key for us because therein we know globally there's always that thoughts about CCUS, but in Nigeria that thought is equally there, but we need to engage stakeholders, and we've started doing that with the Ministry of Environment, Science and Technology, Innovation, industry counterpart, the oil and gas sectors, and also industry. And then importantly is the capacity building. Developing countries will need that capacity because CCUS is kind of new to developing countries, and we have countries like the UK, the US, Canada leading the way, and so it will really be nice to have these countries coming to support developing countries to deal with the capacity to drive CCUS work program. So this part of the work program that we are looking into. Proposed output for CCUS from the work program is one, to have policy measures that could actually drive whole of society to start looking at CCUS in Nigeria and start having demonstration and projects. And there we are not only going to be looking at storage, we'll also be looking at what can we do with this CO2 as part of the energy transition. So clearly we'll be looking at hydrogen production, that's blue hydrogen, methanol production, which has been approved by the government, biofuel production. Then the legal and regulatory framework should also be in place to support CCUS deployment. Then public acceptance should also be in place. I think importantly also is going to be the CCUS Center of Excellence, which we feel and believe that it's going to be key in driving CCUS for a long term in Nigeria. So overall, the role of the Office of the Vice President is to spearhead CCUS strategy, ensure that the strategy is in line with Nigeria's broader energy and climate policy, and to create conditions that stimulate private investment. As I said, before I say thank you, we are working with IEA and the World Bank, and we will start the project, CCUS development project, in January, but we'll be looking at specifically the cement industry and partially the iron and steel. But we are still scoping that, and hopefully that will kickstart a key CCUS project in Nigeria by January. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victor. Excellent to hear these new developments, just really months old. So thank you very much for doing that. I'd now like to introduce and invite up Eivind Berstad, who's a Senior Policy Advisor on CCS in Bellona. Eivind, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tim. Happy to be here. So Bellona is an environmental NGO, and my office is located in Oslo, Norway, but we're also located in other places in the EU and in Russia. So why is an NGO supporting CCS. That is generally because we cannot find any scenario that takes us to net zero without it. It's crucial that we find a way to reduce our emissions as much as possible, as quickly as possible. And that means you cannot do that without carbon capture and storage. So we took this position in the early 90s. We figured out this is how we're going to solve the climate crisis. And also quite fast afterwards, in 1996, this Leipner Field installed CCS. They had to capture their CO2, but they could choose to either emit it or store it. And due to our national CO2 tax, the operator of the Leipner Field chose to store the CO2 instead of emitting it. So it was easy for them based on their business model. All right, so as we have gone through, it's pretty easy. If you have a stream with carbon that is combusted into carbon dioxide, you have to store it in geological storage. Well, when we talk to industries that captures CO2 or has a project on it, they need a dedicated storage. If they don't have access to it, there will be no storage of CO2. And that has resulted in a various of carbon capture and usage projects like synthetic fuels, because there is just no storage available. So it's crucial that we get the infrastructure in place so that all industries that we need in a net zero society have a place to send their CO2. So it's kind of like the whole value chain is turned around. So now you need to develop a storage, and then you need pipelines and ships to transport the CO2 to that storage site. And then this infrastructure can have a normal business relation with point sources all around. So this is crucial for part of the just transition as well, because all industries in all countries need access to a storage site. It's not just the countries that we represent, but also developing economies that do not at the time have projects for carbon capture and storage under development. So you can see this as a common good. Now, we are very happy that we have sewage systems in our cities. It's not something we make a lot of money on, but it cleans up our cities. Now, would you like to live in a house that doesn't have a sewage system? Probably not. We should think about carbon capture and storage in the same way. We need it to clean up our industries. So we're very proud that the Longship Project in Norway is now being developed. So there is a cement plant and there is a waste incinerator that will be connected to infrastructure by ship to the west coast of Norway, where there is permanent storage sites. So this is a blueprint that is very similar to a report we wrote a long time ago. So we're happy to see this being realized now. But it's one of like at least 10 more we need to build in the next decade. So still a lot of work to be done, but it's very cool that we now finally see some value chains being properly developed. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ivan. And I'm really pleased you highlighted the Northern Lights project, the Longship project there. Norway's leading by example there and helping other industrial sources in Europe to decarbonise by providing that storage site with the shipping routes to that. And I know that the UK clusters, I think, hope to follow that model as well. So thank you very much, and especially for standing in at very short notice. I don't know if people have been at the COP26, but it's very large in here and it's quite crowded and it takes a long time to get from A to B. So thank you very much for making it over, Ivan. So last of all, but not least, is Beth Valiaho. from the International CCS Knowledge Centre. And Beth, I'd like to hand over to you now to show your video on your most recent work working on decarbonising cement. So over to you, Beth.
Hi, I'm Beth Valiaho, the Vice President of Strategy and Stakeholder Relations at the International CCS Knowledge Centre. Thank you for joining us today to hear about how carbon capture and storage can decarbonize cement. The International CCS Knowledge Centre houses the engineers and people involved in developing the world's first post-combustion carbon capture and storage facility on a power plant at the Boundary Dam facility in Canada. Early adopters such as this project have not only assumed the risks and costs associated with the learning curve, but are contributing valuable global leadership. Widespread deployment of CCS technologies is essential for successfully tackling climate change. Getting there requires knowledge sharing by first movers. Lessons learned provide a powerful method of sharing ideas for improving work processes, operation, quality, safety, and cost effectiveness. For capital-intensive projects like CCS, utilizing these fundamental building blocks can create efficiencies and help drive down costs through iterations. Because post-combustion capture is a downstream from an emission source, i.e. post-combustion, and because the emissions from a coal-fired power plant are in many ways similar to those from other industrial sources of emissions, post-combustion capture on coal paved the way for other industrial applications, like on cement, iron and steel, and others. You know, these other industrial sectors have often limited abatement options, and CCS is essential in driving reductions globally. With no large-scale CCS facilities currently operating on a cement plant to date, understanding commonalities within previously deployed CCS facilities from other sectors is necessary. Global population expansion, increased urbanization, and economic and social development underpin a continued strong demand for key industrial materials. Cement is used to make concrete. It's the second most consumed material in the world next to water, and basically is the world's most consumed man-made material. The annual global production of cement is more than 4 billion tons. This leads to the CO2 emitted from this sector to be around 7 to 8% of global CO2 emissions. The lessons learned and commercial innovations developed to adapt CCS to the unique challenges of cement facility will be invaluable to advancing the global understanding of and business case for the application of CCS technology more broadly. Distinct from the energy sector, where power production can advance toward the integration of renewables and alternative fuels, in the cement production process, only 1/3 of emissions come from energy requirements. Those emissions can be reduced using various methods, but the remaining 2/3 of CO2 emissions come from production and are the industrial process emissions, which have no other way of being reduced than through capture. Therefore, carbon capture plays a vital role for reducing CO2 emissions for cement. The Lehigh CCS feasibility study, jointly conducted by Lehigh Hanson Materials Limited and the International CCS Knowledge Centre, is aimed at retrofitting a cement production facility at Lehigh's Edmonton, Alberta, Canada site. It's a subsidiary of Heidelberg Cement, with a full-scale post-combustion amine-based carbon capture system, which is a bit of a mouthful. The feasibility study, which received funding from the province of Alberta's Emission Reduction Alberta, has been just finalized. So I'll tell you a little bit more about that today. The successful completion of a commercial-scale CO2 capture plant at the Lehigh facility would accelerate the technological and economic case for applying CCS across countless other heavy-emitting sectors in Canada and around the world, significantly multiplying the economic and environmental benefit of the project. The annual CO2 emissions of a cement plant vary due to clinker production rate, market demand, and the type of fuel being consumed. Due to its energy requirements, a CO2 capture plant will increase the amount of CO2 generated at the overall facility, but at the end of the process, the design of the capture plant can ensure 95% of emissions can be captured. In addition to capturing CO2, a CCS project can result in environmental benefits related to other air pollutants. For a cement plant, reduction in pollutants beyond CO2 has been to practically eliminate emissions from sulfur oxides and particulates, while nitrous oxide emissions continue to stay well below regulated air quality objectives. Concrete can help to provide the foundation for climate-resilient infrastructure. Commitments in this area are already being pursued in large multinational corporations in a bid to accelerate the push to meet climate goals and help develop greener supply chains. Having a verifiable low carbon footprint can add economic value to cement. Applying many significant technical learnings like finding heat and cooling opportunities from within the host facility, understanding differences in operating capacity and availability of the plant compared to past projects, and applying design improvements to optimize the process of capture provides costs for the Lehigh facility at the lower end of the range of global levelized cost of capture estimates. Thank you for your attention and interest. Please go to our website and find out more about the Lehigh CCS feasibility study.
Okay, so thank you very much, Beth, for that. And I know, Beth, you really wanted to be here at COP, but congratulations on your new baby, John Edward, and welcome to him. And I hope everything's going fine for you in these first few days. But we do have Niall McDowell, who's working for the International CCS Knowledge Centre to take questions on that work. So that's all our presentations. New developments, and now I'd like to put the floor open to our audience. If you have any questions you'd like to ask any of the panel, any of us on the panel at all. And please raise your hands to indicate that you'd like to ask a question. So I believe we have a question coming through. I can't see the question yet. Kerry Vincent. Thank you very much, Kerry. Would you like to switch your camera on? And, well, I think they might do that for you. Would you like to give us your question? Thank you.
Thank you to all the speakers for an excellent event, and thank you for the positive messages that CCS is accelerating and is seen as such a critical technology for tackling the climate challenge. I wanted to ask a question to Tim about carbon dioxide removal. You showed us some scenarios and talked about how critical it was to reduce our emissions, but I think that CDR plays an important role as well that's worth saying a little bit more on. So please could you expand on this a little?
Yeah, thanks, Kerry. And you're absolutely right. And at the COP, there's a lot of events and discussion around CDR here. For example, the two initiatives that the US launched last week by Dr. Wilcox. And I think Dr. Wilcox described it quite well, in that it's the emissions that are still left when we reduce emissions from all the large point sources and the other changes we can do in the energy system. To get to net zero, there are still going to be emissions from other sources of man's activity. So its role is understood, and what we do have now are pilot projects being built and operated. Carbon engineering and Climeworks are two examples. They're quite small scale yet, but the climate models are saying we've got to build those up and scale those up quickly to demonstrate the technologies. And in the net zero strategy that Ruth presented from the UK government, even in that, the UK government put a target of 5 million tonnes by 2050, and we're just at the thousands of tonnes scale at the moment. So it's quite an exciting area. There's a lot of interest in it, but it still relies upon CO2 geological storage. This is crucial because we need long-term, permanent and durable removal of the CO2 from the atmosphere, and CO2 geological storage does that. So the developments coming along are really interesting and very exciting in this area. And I guess just to add in something that I learned at this COP, I listened in to a session that was being run to envision the net zero world in 2050. It was quite interesting. I'd not seen this done before, but it placed some key speakers, for example, Julio Friedman, in that world of 2050, and all of their descriptions had emphasized the role of developing countries, overtaking developed countries in their economic low carbon development, including through being operators and owners of direct air capture projects, and the developed world or the North world paying them to do this service to the climate, and in decarbonising in such a way, they developed in other ways. So all the cloud-based systems was one example. were being hosted in these countries. So that was an interesting concept of what the future may look like. We'll see what it does look like, but certainly we need that technology, and it's good to see it being discussed so much here. And there's work still to be done also on the regulatory side from the carbon accounting side. And we're lucky to have Professor Niall McDowell here, who chaired a UK government task force looking at this for the UK side on monitoring and reporting and verification. Perhaps I could just pass this over, continue the question, if you'd just like to say a bit about the work and the outcomes of that task force, Niall.
Yeah, so thanks, Tim. So the purpose of this task force was to try and understand the way in which particularly greenhouse gas removals can be monitored, reported, and verified. So this really builds on the kind of work that Katherine was describing. As you said, Tim, CO2 in the atmosphere causes a problem precisely because of its longevity, and therefore, as Jennifer mentioned, it's really important that the sinks into which that atmospheric carbon is relocated, that they are permanent and durable on the order of thousands, if not tens of thousands of years. And in order to do that, recognizing that there are a pretty diverse portfolio of approaches for removing CO2 from the atmosphere, whether it's into geological storage or into mineral carbonation or indeed biochar and afforestation, as those carbon stocks are developed, the rigorous monitoring of those carbon stocks is really, really important. In some cases, as you mentioned in your introductory remarks, the standards and protocols for the MRV of those carbon sinks, they're very well developed, as in the case of geological storage. But in the context of, for example, biochar or enhanced weathering, the protocols are much less well developed, and there remain really important and interesting science gaps that need to be addressed before those types of projects can proceed on a commercial basis.
Thank you, Niall. And we have another question. Tennant Reid, would you like to ask your question?
Thanks very much, Tim. Tennant Reid from the Australian Industry Group. Confidence that CO2 can be captured and stored is one thing, but confidence that it will be and that will be sustained is another. What do the panellists think are the best policy instruments for creating that confidence?
Okay, I think I'm going to ask two people to answer that from the panel. The first, well, both, I'll tell you in advance. Katherine, if you could talk about the policy instruments in the US, because I think they're quite successful. And Ruth, then if you could talk about the policy instruments for the UK. Katherine.
Sure. Well, in the US, we have regulations for permitting wells on the Environmental Protection Agency for the well-based permitting. And then we also have the accounting for the greenhouse gas accounting. So these are quite rigorous. They're being used right now for the projects that are being stimulated through the driver's 45Q tax credit. And they are quite rigorous. And in fact, there's so many applications right now for projects that many of the states are going to gaining primacy so that they can be the ones doing the regulations. The regulations have to be as strict as the national EPA regulations. And so it's working very well here. We know exactly what we need to do, and the transparency of reporting is also really good. We can go to the greenhouse gas reporting website. We can see exactly what companies are storing CO2, where they are storing it, and how much is being stored. So there's regulations for the safety of geological CO2 storage. The EPA Class 6 well regulations are very much focused on environmental protection of underground sources of drinking water, and also the fact that CO2 will not be admitted into the atmosphere. And if it is, would have to be quantified and credits given back. So the system in the US is robust, it's working, and it's being heavily utilized right now with projects coming online.
And would you say that as a policy instrument, the 45Q is successful?
Absolutely. It's definitely stimulating interest, and we used to feel confident that we knew pretty much every project that was going on, but now there's so much interest that it's almost hard to keep up. So it's really good because we need to scale CCS up. We need to do it correctly during the scale up, and it's looking really good in the U.S. for that right now. We have projects coming online very quickly.
Okay, thank you, Katherine. So Ruth, from the UK and EU perspectives on policy instruments.
Sure. So in the EU, there is the Directive on Geological Storage of CO2, which is referred to as the CCS Directive. And that makes very clear for geological formations that are eligible as storage sites what requirements they need to comply with, and sets out the role of the sort of national authority to regulate and monitor, and the monitoring plans for those sites, and a requirement to monitor them for 20 years after the last injection is made, and for all of that to be very, very transparent. The UK regime basically is based on that and follows the same process. And in the UK, it's the Oil and Gas Authority that provides storage permits, and there have been a number issued. Most recently, I think Harbour Energy got permission for their site. They're part of the Humber Zero cluster. So these permits are being issued. People are being able to comply with those rules and make sure that their storage site is sound and ready for development. In terms of the incentivisation, I guess, to do CCUS, as I've said, the industry in the UK has really come together across sectors, the storage site operators, the transport network developers, and the kind of heavy industries and power plants in these regions. And they've really seen this as an opportunity to become, some of the first zero carbon regions in the world. And they see that really as a lifeline for their future as regions, as part of their economic development. And in fact, and as I said before, the sort of CCUS infrastructure fund, so this sort of upfront capital infrastructure, which is about critical infrastructure for our zero carbon economy, that infrastructure fund will provide and de-risk upfront some of these projects with capital. But also the government is looking at what is the operational incentive to operate this equipment once it's installed. This is an additional cost for these heavy industries, and so they are looking at long-term contracts which will provide a top-up as required to the carbon price that will essentially be a difference payment to make up for the cost of operating these projects. And they are looking at, over time, obviously, as the carbon price rises, they won't need to have that subsidy, but that is a model that they're developing and consulting on at the moment. And what's, I think, really key and what I'm really excited about is the leads of these clusters, when you speak to them, since they have announced that they're going ahead for the mid-2020s operational target, their phone has not stopped ringing with companies from around the world asking them if they could locate their project there between now and 2030, would they be able to connect to this network? So there's a real drive for low carbon products globally, and I think we're starting to see that with the ESG requirements and the investor drive as well as the consumer drive. So I think this is really exciting, and hopefully that will drive this just as much as the government programme.
Okay, thank you, Ruth. Tennant, did that answer your question?
That was terrific, thank you.
Okay. Thanks. And I think longevity in the policies as well as the geological storage, longevity in policies is important. And I don't know, Ruth, you said long-term contracts are being put in place by the government through the business models. Do you know the duration of those?
Yes, so they have proposed 15-year contracts, very much, well, 10 to 15-year contracts, sort of something they're consulting on at the moment. It's very much reflecting, I think, some of the knowledge and experience of trying to get large-scale offshore wind farms off the ground in the UK over the past 10 years, very much drawing on sort of investor feedback through that process, that long-term contracts are bankable and allow a much lower cost of capital to be secured, but also provide that kind of operational certainty for operators of these plants.
Okay. Niall, do you want to add anything to this, to these answers? You look like you might want to.
Very briefly, I mean, I really enjoyed the way that Ivan sort of switched it around, and the incentive of creating a demand pull for storing CO2 as opposed to using more of a stick-based approach, I think is really interesting to incentivize the creation of that industry. And in that context, I'm personally terribly enthusiastic about the 45Q type model in the US, particularly if this revision to bring it up to $85 a ton comes true.
Mm-hmm. So can I ask a question then of Victor? So we know that South Africa has got World Bank funding and they're developing a pilot project there. And they started with the storage atlas that Katherine described. And now we understand that Trinidad and Tobago are learning from them. Do you think Nigeria can become a leading country for the northern part of Africa to show other countries on how to progress CCUS?
Yeah, definitely. Nigeria is a country that I think the whole world knows. So when you talk about Nigeria, you talk about Africa, as a whole. So currently, what we're trying to do from Nigeria context is to work with industrial experts, including IEA and the likes of all of you here, to start looking at constituting what we call the African CCUS network that we hope to launch by second quarter next year. We've already started the conversation. South Africa, Angola, and also the countries in Africa that have actually committed themselves to CCUS, and NDC will be part of it, that we start having that conversation. And once we do that, of course, as I said, with partners like you guys here, we start looking at how we can form the same thing that the Asian CCUS network are doing, and then from there, try to launch it, as I said, second quarter next year, all things being equal, right? But definitely Nigeria will be leading that conversation amongst the African, within the context of CCUS.
Okay, very good. Ivan, can I ask you about the European scene? And what would Bellona like to see happen next within Europe?
I think an indication of what works in this context is to develop storage. So as soon as a storage site is announced, the call is not silent. All the proposed projects are being filled by a factor of 10 very quickly. So there is definitely many industries looking for a place to store their CO2. So infrastructure is the most important thing we need to develop, and then more and more point sources will connect to that infrastructure. I'm very confident about that.
Okay. And then I think we've got time for one more question to Niall about the work that Beth presented that the Knowledge Centre are doing on taking their learnings from the Boundary Dam project and applying them to the Lehigh project. Why is that good? Why is that a good idea? Why does that work?
So I think, as people have mentioned earlier in this session, CCS a long time ago was considered to be a sort of a clean coal technology, right? And the reality is that may have been the case back then, but now we understand much more the imperative to decarbonize all of the industrial point sources, and particularly cement. It's one of these products that one simply cannot produce without the co-production of a CO2 waste as a problem. And the other piece that's really interesting is that the composition and flow rates and basically the types of exhaust gases that you need to deal with in the context of cement are very, very similar to what, for example, the CCS Knowledge Centre and the SaskPower people were dealing with in the context of the Boundary Dam project, the BD3 unit. So from an engineering and technical perspective, all of the experience that has been acquired in developing CCS on coal, whether it was in Boundary Dam or in Petronova, much, if not all of that, can be directly transferred across into the context of developing CCS projects on cement. So huge learnings. And then in Beth's presentation, you saw how precipitously the costs of CCS decline with experience. And so by doing that knowledge sharing and knowledge transfer, we can leapfrog all of those sort of first-of-a-kind hiccups that one might anticipate in a cement case and get to sort of nth-of-a-kind that much more quickly. So the value proposition there is immense.
And is there interest being shown by the wider cement industry? So we know that one of the Norwegian projects within the Northern Lights that Ivan mentioned is cement plant, and that's being built at the moment. We have the Lehigh project. on the developments elsewhere as well?
Emphatically, yeah. I mean, again, Katherine will be much more knowledgeable about this than I am, but throughout the United States, also in Europe, there are many industrial folks looking at this, whether it's in the retrofit application of CCS technologies or in the new build. And then as we leave sort of the US and Europe behind and move to other parts of the world where, you know, much of the cement needs yet to be produced, there are, I think, very exciting opportunities for, you know, the creation and construction of new cement processes and plants, which can incorporate new technologies.
Okay, yeah, Katherine.
I also wanted to go back and go back to the storage, what Ivan said. You know, you really need storage first, even for direct air capture. In Iceland, the Orca project, you know, CarbFix was a project in Iceland that was looking at how to store CO2 in the basalts in the volcanic rocks of Iceland. And if it hadn't have been for that work, looking into the storage, the direct air capture going on with the Orca project couldn't have really happened. So we really need to prove up our storage as an initial activity, and then you know, and then as you said, also the transport system is really important as well. And in the U.S., we have about 6,000 kilometers of CO2 pipelines already in existence, but we know we need to upscale to 80,000 kilometers of pipelines. And so that takes planning in advance, you know. So I think that what you said is really important, you know. You understand your storage, and that gives you the potential for your negative emissions and also your primary emissions reductions on industry. And then the transport system but then must be planned between the two. So I really liked what you said about that.
Okay. So I think we're coming towards the end of our time for this side event. I think we've had some really exciting new developments shared by our panelists, and they're here to share with you. That's their enthusiasm in being here at all, is to share the learnings from these developments with you and people who may want to do this in other countries and other regions and other projects and other applications. And all of the organisations involved in putting this side event together, that's the Carbon Capture and Storage Association, the University of Texas, the International CCS Knowledge Centre, and IEAGHG and Bellona, all have good information resources available through their websites as well as directly by speaking to the people. And I'd like to thank, from IEAGHG's point of view, our members, 36 member countries and companies, for supporting us. And in COP26, we also have a virtual exhibit under the collaboration of these organisations as well. So I do recommend, if you'd like some more information, find our virtual exhibit. They're normally physical, but at this COP they're virtual, and see if the information there is of interest as well. There are videos on there, as well as documents, etc. as well. So with that, we're coming to the end of the session. I'd like to think we have an audience applauding us virtually, digitally, but I think we should applaud each other and applaud the audience for coming along. Thank you for being interested and asking questions.